Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here. Tell me, is there a lamp burning near you and something warm to drink? These are the hours Watson trusted most, when stillness sharpened the mind and reason moved quietly through the dark. Tonight we follow him somewhere snowbound and sealed, where truth concealed itself with considerable elegance. Do subscribe so no chapter escapes you. Now settle in, for the world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes. Find us on Spotify. The link is just below. Chapter 1. The Snowbound. Estate of Blackridge. It is not without some reluctance that I set down the particulars of the affair which I have come to call, in my private notes, the matter of the sealed evidence packet. My hesitation springs not from any deficiency in the facts themselves, which are both curious and instructive, but rather from the circumstance that several of the persons involved still move in respectable society, and that the events I am about to describe touched upon reputations of no small delicacy. Nevertheless, time has done its merciful work upon the principles of the case, and I am persuaded that an honest account, preserved in the manner of those earlier chronicles which my readers have been kind enough to receive with interest, can do no further harm to the living, and may perhaps illuminate certain principles of observation which Holmes himself would wish transmitted to posterity. It was during one of the most severe winters that I can recall, in all my years of London residence, that the business began. I had called upon Holmes at Baker Street on a Tuesday afternoon toward the end of January, finding him in that particular state of concentrated idleness which I had come to recognise as more dangerous than any of his fits of energy. He lay upon the settee with his long legs extended toward the fire, a cold pipe balanced between his fingers, and his grey eyes fixed upon the ceiling with an expression of profound dissatisfaction. The room was in considerable disorder, which was, of course, its natural condition, but there was about Holmes himself a restlessness that told me plainly he had gone too long without occupation. "You have come to rescue me from my own company, Watson," said he without turning his head. "I am grateful for the intention, though I suspect you have brought nothing more stimulating than last week's British Medical Journal, which I observe you have tucked inside your coat." I drew the journal from my coat with a mild exasperation that was, after so many years, largely theatrical. "I had thought of lending it to you," I said, settling into my accustomed chair, "though I confess I did not imagine you would require rescuing this particular afternoon." "Any afternoon is an occasion for rescue when the intelligence has nothing upon which to exercise itself." He sat upright with sudden energy and gestured toward the mantelpiece. "However, we may be spared the necessity. That telegram arrived not 40 minutes ago, and I have been weighing its implications ever since." I took up the telegram and read it with some interest. It was from Sir Alister Pencomb, a name I recognised at once, for his reputation as a magistrate of exceptional probity had been widely remarked upon during several celebrated trials of the preceding decade. The message was brief, as befitted the character of the man. "Mr. Holmes, a matter of considerable delicacy has arisen at Blackridge Manor. I would be grateful for your immediate attendance. The roads are passable at present, but may not remain so. I cannot communicate further by wire. Will you come?" Pencomb. A retired magistrate, I observed, and one of the old school if I remember correctly. He would not send such a message unless the circumstances genuinely warranted it. "Precisely my own conclusion," said Holmes, springing to his feet with a promptness that rather betrayed how eagerly he had already resolved to accept. "The restraint of the message is itself eloquent. A man of Pencomb's legal training knows what may and may not be committed to writing. That he will say nothing further by wire suggests documents, or persons, or both. Fetch your coat and your bag, Watson. I suspect we shall be away for some days." We departed London on the evening train, and thereafter by a hired conveyance that carried us through darkening countryside, as the last pale light faded from the sky, and the first serious snow of the night began to fall. I sat wrapped in my travelling coat and watched the flakes gather against the glass with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has resigned himself to discomfort. Holmes sat opposite me in silence, but it was the alert, attentive silence of a mind already at work, not the brooding vacancy of Baker Street. And Blackridge Manor presented itself to us at last as a long, grey, substantial house, set among elms whose bare branches had become, by that hour, elaborate constructions of white and shadow. Lights burned in several of the ground-floor windows, giving the place an appearance of warmth that was, as I afterwards had reason to reflect, somewhat deceptive in its promise. The snow had deepened considerably during our journey, and I noted as we alighted that the tracks of the last previous carriage were already more suggestion than impression. We were received by a manservant of the old-fashioned imperturbable variety, and conducted at once to a well-appointed library where our host awaited us. Sir Alister Pencomb was a man of perhaps 65 years, with the erect bearing and measured deliberateness of one long accustomed to authority. His white hair was neatly arranged, his evening dress irreproachable, and his manner, though clearly under some strain, entirely composed. He greeted us with a courtesy that contained real relief. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I'm most grateful for your promptness." He indicated chairs arranged near the fire and took his own seat with the careful movements of a man in whom dignity is both genuine and habitual. "I should not have imposed upon you had the situation admitted of any other course." "Pray describe it to us exactly as it stands," said Holmes, his eyes already moving with quiet industry about the room. Sir Alister inclined his head. "You will wish to know first who is in the house." He enumerated them with the methodical precision one might expect from a former officer of the court. There was, besides himself, Mr. or Edmund Ellery, a barrister of some standing who had been a professional acquaintance for many years, Colonel Hartley Morn, late of the Indian service, and a companion of long friendship, Mrs. Sylvia Darnley, a widow of comfortable means whose late husband had moved in legal circles, Miss Eugenia Pencomb, Sir Alister's niece, a young woman of some intelligence who managed his household in the absence of any other domestic authority, and Miss Clara Hargreaves, his private secretary, who had been with him for 3 years. A small establishment of servants completed the number. "The storm came upon us 2 days ago," Sir Alister continued, "rather more swiftly than the weather reports had suggested it would. The roads are now quite impassable, as your own journey must have illustrated, and I do not expect them clear before Thursday at the earliest. We are, in short, confined." "And the nature of the difficulty?" Holmes prompted. Sir Alister paused, and for the first time I saw something move behind the judicial composure of his face, a shadow of personal distress that sat there briefly and then was mastered. "It concerns a sealed evidence packet," he said, "which has been in my custody for some years, and which has, as of this morning, vanished from a locked drawer to which I alone possess the key." Holmes said nothing. He merely looked at Sir Alister steadily, with those clear, penetrating eyes, in which no surprise was ever visible, and gave a single small nod that indicated he had received and retained every syllable. I glanced about the library at the cheerful fire, the well-ordered shelves, and the composed face of our host, and felt, as I had felt on 100 previous occasions in Holmes's company, the distinct and particular sensation of standing at the edge of something that was not yet visible, but was most certainly present, waiting in the ordinary darkness between ordinary things for someone with the requisite faculty to bring it into the light. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and Blackridge Manor settled further into its white and silent isolation. Chapter 2. The Matter of the Sealed Packet. Sir Alister rose from his chair with the measured deliberateness of a man who has long since learned that composure, maintained at sufficient cost, is itself a form of testimony. He crossed to a cabinet beside the window, withdrew a decanter of brandy, and set 3 glasses upon the small table between us with an unhurried precision that I recognised, in the way of one physician observing another's patient, as the outward discipline of a genuinely unsettled mind. "You will forgive me," he said, "if I ask that what I am about to tell you be held in the strictest confidence, at least until we have determined the full extent of the matter." "You may rely upon our discretion," I replied. Holmes had said nothing. He was seated in the attitude which I knew to indicate his fullest attention, elbows upon the arms of the chair, fingertips pressed lightly together, his eyes resting upon Sir Alister with an expression of calm and patient expectancy. He had not touched the brandy. "Some 8 years ago," Sir Alister began, settling himself once more, "I was called upon to serve in a judicial capacity in connection with a matter that was, for reasons which will become apparent, never brought to public trial. The case involved a series of financial transactions of a deeply irregular nature, conducted over a period of years by a gentleman of considerable social position. The evidence against him was, in my assessment, conclusive. However, the gentleman in question died before proceedings could be formally initiated, and it was deemed, by those with the authority to make such determinations, that no useful purpose would be served by posthumous prosecution." "The evidence was suppressed," Holmes observed, without inflection. "The evidence was sealed," Sir Alister corrected him, with a slight stiffening of the shoulders that suggested the distinction was not merely semantic to him. "Sealed and entrusted to my custody, with the understanding that it would be produced if circumstances ever required it. That is a material difference, Mr. Holmes." "It is," Holmes conceded. "Pray continue." "The packet, as Sir Alister described it, was a sealed envelope of considerable thickness, bound with legal tape and secured with a wax impression of his own private seal. It had been kept, for the duration of its time at Blackridge, in a locked drawer of his writing desk in the private study, a room which adjoined his bedroom and to which the household had no general access. The key to the drawer was kept upon his watch chain, which was, in the way of all his habits, never removed from his person during waking hours and placed on his bedside table during the night. The packet was present when I last examined it, or 3 days ago," he said. "I had occasion to verify its presence when I was making arrangements in anticipation of the storm, checking various documents that might be relevant if communications with London were to be delayed. This morning, upon opening the drawer, I found the packet gone." "Nothing else disturbed?" Holmes asked. "Nothing that I have been able to identify. The drawer contained, beside the packet, several letters of a private nature, a small notebook, and a quantity of loose papers relating to my correspondence. All of these appeared to be precisely as I left them, and the lock showed no indication of interference. None that I could detect. The mechanism operates exactly as it always has, and I can see no mark upon it that was not there previously." Holmes unfolded himself from his chair at this point and stood, in directing his next question toward the fire rather than our host, which was a habit of his when the question was, in his private assessment, of particular importance. "You have spoken of this packet to no one presently in the house?" Sir Alister's reply came after a pause that was fractionally too long. "I have not spoken of its contents," he said carefully. "However, it is possible that its existence is not entirely unknown. When I received it, 8 years ago, I was not yet in sole residence at Blackridge. My household arrangements was different at that time." Holmes turned from the fire. "I see. And the guests presently with you. How did this gathering come about? Is it usual for you to have company at this season?" It was not, as it transpired, a gathering of any particular design. Only Colonel Morn had been visiting for a fortnight, an arrangement of long standing. Mr. Ellery had arrived 5 days previously to discuss certain legal affairs arising from Sir Alister's estate planning. Mrs. Darnley had come for a brief visit connected, Sir Alister explained with some delicacy, with certain charitable matters in which they shared an interest. Miss Pencombe was, of course, a permanent resident. Miss Hargreaves lived in the village and came daily to work, but had been confined to the house by the storm since Monday. "So the storm was not anticipated when most of your guests arrived," I said. "It was not. The forecast had suggested a light snowfall of a day or two's duration. What we have received is rather more emphatic." Holmes picked up his brandy glass at last and turned it in his fingers without drinking from it. It was an idle gesture, the sort which, I had learned over years of acquaintance, generally indicated that he was arranging a series of observations into a preliminary order. "Tell me," he said, Was there any occasion in the days before the packet's disappearance when your study was accessible to others? A period, however brief, when the room was unoccupied and the door unlocked? Sir Alister considered this with evident care. My study is not, as a rule, locked during the day. I work there in the mornings and sometimes in the afternoons, but there are inevitably periods when I am elsewhere in the house or in the grounds. I do not routinely lock the room behind me when I step out. It has never seemed necessary. Has it ever seemed necessary before this week? There was a silence of some seconds. No, said Sir Alister. And something in the quality of that single syllable conveyed, more plainly than elaboration could have done, that the realization was not a comfortable one. Holmes set down the untouched brandy, and when he spoke again there was the quiet authority in his voice that I associated with those moments when, beneath the apparently open field of an investigation, his mind had already begun to map the concealed terrain. I should like to examine the study tonight, if you are agreeable. Tomorrow I shall speak with each of your guests individually. I would ask, Sir Alister, that you say nothing to them of the packet's disappearance beyond the fact that a private document has been mislaid. It would be premature to characterize the matter more precisely. You suspect one of them, I said quietly, as Sir Alister withdrew to arrange a lamp for the study. I suspect all of them equally, which is to say, I suspect none of them yet, Holmes replied, at the same low pitch. But I note this, Watson. A man of Pencombe's training does not send an urgent telegram to Baker Street and describe the matter as one of considerable delicacy merely because a document has been mislaid. He is frightened. Not of the loss itself, but of what the loss implies, and rather more importantly, of who in this house may have had reason to engineer it. He moved toward the door and I followed, drawing my coat about me against the chill of the corridor, while behind us the fire settled in the grate and the snow pressed silently and without pause against the long dark windows of Blackridge Manor. Whatever ease the house had presented to us upon our arrival was, I now understood, the ease of a surface only. Beneath it, in the manner of ice forming over deep and turbulent water, something else had been gathering. It had been gathering, Holmes's few quiet words suggested, for rather longer than any of us supposed. Chapter 3. An Impossibility of Access. Sir Alister's study was a room of modest proportions but considerable character. It occupied a corner of the first floor with 2 windows giving onto the rear grounds, where at that hour nothing was visible beyond a uniform blackness in which the snow could be sensed rather than seen. The furnishings were those of a working scholar rather than a gentleman of leisure. A large writing desk of dark oak positioned to catch the morning light. Shelves of legal volumes in uniform bindings, a plain mantelpiece supporting a clock and nothing else, and 2 leather chairs drawn up to a fireplace in which the embers of that evening's fire still gave off a thin reddish warmth. The room had the quality of a mind made habitable, orderly without being cold, purposeful without being severe. Holmes stood in the doorway for a full half-minute before entering, which was a practice of his I had observed many times and which I had long since ceased to find eccentric. He was, I understood, composing the room in his mind as it stood before him, so that any subsequent alteration, however slight, would register against the original impression. Then he stepped inside and Sir Alister and I followed. The writing desk stood against the wall to our left. It was a substantial piece, and with 3 drawers arranged in a column on the right-hand side and a broad leather-surfaced writing area that was, at present, cleared of all but a blotter, an inkstand, and a small arrangement of correspondence weighted by a polished stone. Holmes went to it immediately and crouched to examine the lock of the second drawer, which Sir Alister indicated as the one in question. Producing from his waistcoat the small key upon his watch chain, and setting it down beside the inkstand with the deliberate care of a man laying down something he would very much prefer not to have reason to lay down at all. Holmes produced his lens and bent over the lock for some moments in silence. He then inserted the key and withdrew it, examining the mechanism's action with evident attention. I watched from a few feet away, aware of how little useful observation I was likely to add, and content, therefore, to remain still and let him work. "No scratching on the faceplate," he said, half to himself. "No bright marks on the bolt. The key has not been copied by any crude method. And yet—" He paused, and in the quality of that pause I heard the first genuine note of interest. He moved the lamp closer and bent once more, this time directing his lens not at the lock, but at the surface of the desk immediately surrounding the drawer. He remained in this position for what seemed, to my waiting patience, a considerable time. "There," he said at last, though he made no effort to indicate the object of his observation to me or to Sir Alister, who stood near the mantelpiece with his hands clasped behind his back, in the attitude of a man submitting to a procedure he does not fully understand but has resolved to trust. Holmes straightened and moved to the left-hand edge of the writing surface, where he examined the blotter with similar attention. Then he crossed to the window, inspected the latch and the sill, and returned to the centre of the room, where he stood quite still for a moment, with his eyes moving slowly about the walls and floor. "The windows were fastened from within," Sir Alister offered. "They were, and have been throughout the storm which rules out external interference via the obvious route. Though I will remark," Holmes added, with the slight dryness he reserved for observations that others might have preferred he kept to himself, that it does not rule out interference by someone already within." He turned to Sir Alister. "You place the key on your bedside table each night, you said. Is your bedroom door locked when you sleep?" "It is not. I have never considered it necessary." "And the connecting door between your bedroom and this study?" Sir Alister was briefly silent. "It is generally closed, but not, I admit, locked." Holmes received this information with a small nod that declined to become an expression. "One further question for tonight. The packet itself, could you describe it with some precision? Its dimensions, the nature of the seal, any distinguishing feature that would make it immediately recognisable?" Sir Alister considered. It was a large envelope of the legal variety, perhaps 12 inches in length and 8 across. It was bound with red tape tied in a flat knot. The seal was an impression in dark blue wax made with my own seal ring, which I wear still. He extended his right hand briefly, showing a heavy signet ring on the third finger. The initials AP intertwined, with a small crest above. It is not a common design. I had it made to my own specification some 30 years ago. Holmes looked at the ring for a moment, then away. "Thank you, Sir Alister. I think I have seen enough for this evening. I would ask only that this room be locked tonight, with yourself holding the key, and that things be left precisely as they are. Watson, shall we?" We made our way to the rooms that had been prepared for us, Holmes carrying the lamp and I following through a corridor in which the house had settled into that particular nighttime stillness which large country houses achieve when the fires are banked and the inhabitants retired. It was as we passed the head of the main staircase that we both became aware simultaneously of a sound below. It was, or appeared to be, a footstep. A single, deliberate footstep on the tiled floor of the entrance hall, followed by silence of the decisive kind that succeeds an abrupt self-correction. Holmes lifted the lamp and looked down into the hallway, but whoever or whatever had produced the sound had withdrawn beyond our angle of vision. He stood quite still, listening, for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he continued toward our rooms without comment. And it was not until we had reached the door of his that he spoke. "You heard it." "I did. One of the guests, perhaps. A nocturnal habit, or insomnia brought on by the weather." "Perhaps." He regarded the door of his room with the expression of a man who is not thinking about doors. "Or a visit to some part of the house that cannot be easily explained, and a retreat upon discovering that the house was not entirely at rest. The distinction matters, Watson, though we cannot determine it tonight." He pushed the door open. "Sleep well. Tomorrow will require considerable patience from us both." I lay awake for some time after retiring, listening to the unrelenting quiet of the snow. It is a peculiar quality of that silence, snow silence, that it seems to suppress not only sound but thought, and pressing upon the consciousness with a muffled insistence that is neither peaceful nor alarming but simply present. I found myself turning over the facts of the case as I knew them. The locked drawer, the inaccessible key, the sealed room, the curious suggestion in Holmes's manner when he had straightened from his examination of the desk and said, with that particular restrained satisfaction, "There." He had seen something. He had seen it and elected, for reasons of his own, to say nothing of it to Sir Alister or to me. That was not in itself unusual. Holmes rarely shared an observation until he had determined what it meant. But the manner of his restraint, the slight contraction about his eyes that I associated with a detail of genuine significance, told me that whatever lay on or near that writing desk, it was not nothing. The assumption that the drawer could only be opened by the key upon Sir Alister's watch chain was, it seemed to me, of the sort that Holmes had already moved well beyond. The lock was intact. The packet was gone. The impossibility, as he had suggested in the telegram, lay not in the fact of access, but in some misconception about the means of it. It was on that thought, unresolved and rather unsettling, that I finally slept. Chapter 4. The curious case of the duplicate seal, morning at Blackridge, arrived with the particular grey determination of a winter's day that has decided against improvement. The snow had ceased during the night, but the sky above the elm tops retained the flat, loaded quality of a ceiling that might yet deliver more. Sudden, and the grounds lay under a stillness so complete that even the birds appeared to have suspended their usual commentary. I dressed and descended to find the household already assembled at breakfast, in that slightly artificial state of collective cheerfulness which people of good breeding adopt when confined by circumstance to one another's company beyond the natural term of their patience. Holmes was not present. This did not surprise me. He had his own methods of beginning a day, and they rarely involved the social ritual of a shared breakfast table. The guests presented themselves much as Sir Alister had described them. Colonel Morn was a broad, weathered man of perhaps 60, with the deliberate movements and economical speech of one who has spent a career making rapid decisions in conditions that did not permit revision. He sat at the far end of the table with a plate of considerable substance before him, and addressed himself to it with the same competent efficiency he might have applied to any practical task. Mr. Ellery, the barrister, was his opposite in nearly every physical particular. Slight, precise, with carefully arranged dark hair going silver at the temples, and an expression of contained alertness that I associated with men who make their living by listening to others and finding what is absent from their accounts. He and I exchanged pleasantries about the weather with the slightly weary goodwill of two professionals sharing a waiting room. Mrs. Darnley sat beside Miss Pencombe at the window end of the table. She was, I judged, somewhere in the middle portion of her 40s, handsome in a composed and rather guarded way, Caesars with dark eyes that moved with more frequency and less apparent purpose than the rest of her face suggested. She spoke little, applied herself to her coffee with concentration, and did not look toward the corridor that led to Sir Alister's study, which, given that there was nothing particular to see in that direction, constituted in my estimation a form of attention of its own kind. Miss Pencombe was younger, perhaps 28, with a direct manner and practical hands that suggested she was rather more capable than the role of resident niece might ordinarily require. Miss Hargreaves, seated near the door, was a woman of similar age but quite different disposition, composed and quiet, with the ink-stained fingers I had been told to expect and the slightly compressed attention of someone accustomed to listening without being much consulted. I had not been at the table above 20 minutes when Holmes appeared in the doorway, acknowledged the company with a brief inclusive nod, declined the offer of anything cooked, accepted coffee, and settled himself into the remaining chair with an air of such complete indifference to social expectation that I observed Mr. Ellery watch him for a moment with something between curiosity and professional assessment. It was after breakfast, as the guests dispersed to the drawing-room, the library, and in Colonel Morn's case the billiard-room, that Holmes drew me aside in the corridor. "I have been in the study since 6, he said, without preamble, keeping his voice low. "Sir Alister was good enough to lend me the key. I want you to look at something." The study in morning light was a different proposition from the lamplit room of the previous evening, and I was struck as I entered by how ordinary it appeared, how entirely the daylight normalised the desk and the shelves and the cold grate. Holmes led me directly to the writing desk and indicated, without touching it, a spot on the leather surface approximately 4 inches to the left of the inkstand. "Tell me what you see," he said. I bent and looked. There was, at the point he had indicated, a faint circular mark on the leather, no larger than a shilling, with a slight ridge at its perimeter that gave it something of the character of an impression rather than a stain. The leather in the precise centre of the mark was very slightly depressed, as if a small, warm, weighted object had rested there. A wax impression, I said, or the remnant of one, specifically the remnant of a wax preparation applied and removed with care. The depression at the centre is consistent with the base of a seal ring being pressed into softened wax. The residue that remains is minimal but present. He produced his lens and held it over the spot. Under magnification, you can observe a very faint trace of blue pigment in the leather grain. The same dark blue, I think we may safely venture, as the wax described by Sir Alistair. I straightened. The implications arranged themselves with uncomfortable clarity. Someone made an impression of the seal, here, at this desk, before the packet was taken. Before the packet was taken in its present form, yes, the seal was copied, Watson. And not the contents, at least not yet. The wax impression would be used to manufacture a duplicate seal, indistinguishable in appearance from the original, which would allow the packet to be opened, its contents examined or removed, and then resealed in a manner that might pass cursory inspection. He moved to the chair behind the desk and regarded the leather surface with the expression of a man reading a text that has been partially erased. It required access to this room, a small quantity of prepared wax, and sufficient composure to work at another man's desk without being disturbed. None of these requirements presents an insuperable difficulty to someone resident in this house. "Ellery," I said. It came out rather more promptly than I had intended. Holmes glanced at me with a slight elevation of one eyebrow. "You have reached the same point that our thief intended us to reach, which is precisely why I urge you to hold it loosely. Ellery is a barrister. He understands seals and legal documents. He arrived 5 days ago, giving him ample opportunity. He's the most professionally proximate suspect. He is therefore," Holmes concluded, with the particular emphasis he reserved for such reversals, "the candidate who requires the most careful scrutiny before any weight is placed upon his apparent fitness for the role. You think the evidence against him is manufactured? I think it is convenient, and I have a long acquaintance with evidence that presents itself conveniently. It does not follow that Ellery is innocent. It follows that we must be precise." He rose. "I am going to speak with him this morning, and I would be grateful if you would, in the course of natural conversation, find occasion to sit with Mrs. Darnley. Ask her about her late husband. People of her kind reveal more in eulogies than they intend." I found Mrs. Darnley in the drawing-room an hour later, ostensibly reading, though the pages had not, as far as I could observe, turned since she had sat down. She received my company with a graciousness that I suspected cost her something, and we spoke for a time about the country, the cold, and the peculiar intimacy enforced by snowbound confinement. When I introduced, with what I hoped was a natural casualness, the subject of her late husband, something shifted in the quality of her attention. She spoke of him warmly, with practised ease, describing a man of public generosity and considerable social accomplishment. But her eyes, which had met mine readily enough on every other topic, moved away from me when she spoke his name and did not return, and there was in her account of his life and character the slight, unmistakable smoothness of a narrative that has been told before, to oneself and others, until it has become less a recollection than a prepared text. I reported all of this to Holmes that evening. He listened without interruption, and when I had finished he was quiet for a moment. "Her husband," he said at last, "and not his business interests, nor his legal affairs, nor his reputation. She spoke of the man himself." "With some care," I confirmed. Holmes nodded slowly. Yes, she would. Chapter 5. What the Eye Overlooks. There is a particular quality to the second full day of enforced confinement that differs materially from the first. On the first day, people are still performing their accustomed social selves with reasonable conviction, still maintaining the small fictions of ease and indifference upon which civilized company depends. By the second, the performance has begun to cost something, and that cost, subtle as it is, becomes visible to anyone who knows where to look. Holmes, needless to say, knew precisely where to look, and he spent the greater part of that Wednesday engaged in a series of conversations which, to the casual observer, must have appeared to be nothing more than the amiable exchanges of a house guest filling idle hours. I watched him work from a careful distance, understanding by long experience that my most useful role in these preliminary stages was to be present without being obtrusive, and to register what I could in the gaps between his more focused attentions. He spent the late morning with Colonel Morn, the two of them ostensibly examining a large ordnance map of the region that had been produced by Sir Alister from the library shelves as a means of estimating when the northern road might again be passable. I could not hear the substance of their conversation from my position near the window, but I observed Holmes glance downward twice in the space of 10 minutes, and I noted what had drawn his eye. The Colonel's boots, set to dry before the fireplace, which bore along their uppers and at the instep a quantity of dried mud that bore no resemblance to the pale, chalky residue of the manor's gravel paths. It was darker, and it carried with it, even at my distance, the faint suggestion of the heavier, in damper earth found at the margins of a garden bed or a frost-softened lawn. The Colonel, who had told Sir Alister on the previous evening that he had not ventured out since the storm began, appeared entirely comfortable discussing the impediments to travel in the present weather. He was a man of equable surface, and it served him well, but he had been outside, and recently, and Holmes had established as much without the inconvenience of asking. After luncheon, during which the company gathered with the slightly strained civility of people who have begun to tire of one another's familiar remarks, Holmes contrived to sit beside Miss Hargreaves in the library under the pretext of consulting Sir Alister's index of legal references for a matter he described, with transparent vagueness, as a personal affair. Miss Hargreaves, whose professional function was precisely this kind of assistance, settled into the familiar role with evident relief, and they spent the better part of an hour among the shelves. I joined them briefly on the pretence of selecting something to read, and while I stood with my back to them and my attention apparently upon the spines before me, I registered two things. The first was that Miss Hargreaves's ink-stained fingers, of which I had taken note at breakfast, bore the staining in a pattern inconsistent with the ordinary morning's correspondence, extending as it did not merely to the tips of the right hand but to the lateral surface of the left palm, which is the mark not of writing but of tracing, of running a hand repeatedly across a surface covered in fresh or barely dried ink. The second was that when Holmes, and with perfect innocence, asked her whether she'd been engaged in any particular project for Sir Alister during the preceding days, her answer, though pleasant and unhesitating, did not quite account for her hours. She had been engaged, she said, in the indexing of old correspondence, a project of several days. She gestured to a stack of folders on the reading table, with the ease of someone indicating corroborating evidence they are confident will not be too closely examined. Holmes thanked her, and did not examine the folders. He told me about the folders later, in the interval before dinner, when we found ourselves briefly alone in the corridor outside our respective rooms. "The folders are genuine," he said. "The indexing project is genuine, but she has not been working on it exclusively. And the nature of the ink traces on her left hand interests me considerably. It is the mark of someone who has been making careful copies of something, pressing a clean sheet over an inked original to produce a transfer impression. A technique used, among other purposes, for duplicating documents whose contents one wishes to examine without altering the original." "You think she has copied the contents of the packet?" "I think she has copied something, and I think she's been rather careful about it. Whether that something is the sealed packet or something else entirely that she does not wish to discuss, I cannot yet determine." He paused. "She is protecting someone, Watson. That much I'm prepared to say. Whether she knows what she's protecting them from is a separate question." It was toward the late afternoon, with the light already failing and the lamps being lit throughout the house, that I had occasion to observe Miss Pencombe. She had been, throughout the day, the most apparently occupied of the guests, moving through the house with the quiet competence of someone accustomed to managing its rhythms, consulting with the housekeeper, overseeing the arrangement of rooms, directing the servants with a naturalness that suggested long practice. But I noticed, in the course of crossing from the drawing-room to the hall at approximately 3:30, that she altered her route at the junction of the main corridor and the side passage leading to Sir Alister's study, turning in a direction that added some distance to whatever errand had brought her downstairs, in a manner so practised and so apparently unconscious that I might easily have attributed it to habit. It was not habit, I thought. Habit moves without self-awareness. What I had observed was self-awareness so thoroughly rehearsed as to resemble habit. There is a difference, and it is most legible in the particular quality of deliberateness that attends a motion the body has not entirely forgotten it is choosing. I mentioned it to Holmes at dinner, conveying it beneath the ordinary noise of the meal in a low voice while the Colonel engaged Sir Alister in a discussion of the Transvaal at the far end of the table. "Yes," Holmes said simply without surprise. "She has been avoiding that corridor since the morning we arrived. Not without reason." He tasted his wine with the absent attention of a man whose thoughts are elsewhere. "Consider, Watson, what it means to avoid a place. It may mean fear of discovery. It may mean knowledge of something one would prefer not to have confirmed. Or it may mean," he added, returning his glass to the table, "that one was in that corridor at a time one cannot account for without difficulty, and has since concluded that proximity invites question." At dinner's end, as the company dispersed to their various evening occupations, Holmes spoke 2 sentences to me that served, as his summaries so often did, to reframe everything I thought I had understood. "Truth resides not in declarations, but in the quiet testimony of objects," he said. "Tomorrow I shall let the objects speak at greater length." He did not elaborate, and I did not ask him to. There was in his manner the particular settled quality that told me he had arrived somewhere, not yet at the destination, but at the last crossroads before it, where the paths had thinned and the correct one, if not yet obvious, had at least become distinguishable from the rest. I went to bed in better spirits than I had any rigorous reason to justify, which is, I have found, one of the more reliable symptoms of being in the vicinity of Holmes when he is genuinely on the scent. Chapter 6. The silence between words. Thursday brought a change in the weather, though not the improvement we had been promised. The sky cleared in the small hours and turned hard and brilliant, the kind of cold that announces itself through window glass before one has left the bed. We and the grounds of Blackridge Manor emerged in the early light as a landscape of such severe and glittering whiteness that it seemed almost to be asserting an argument. The roads, as the manservant reported at breakfast with the sympathetic gravity of a physician delivering unwelcome news, remained entirely impassable. We were, for at least another day, where we were. I noted the effect of this announcement upon the table. Colonel Morn received it with soldierly equanimity. Mr. Ellery set down his cup with a precision that suggested controlled frustration. Miss Pencombe said nothing, but looked out at the frozen grounds with an expression I could not interpret to my satisfaction. Mrs. Darnley, who had been the last to appear that morning, received the information with a stillness so complete that it passed well beyond composure into something I could only describe, applying the clinical vocabulary of my profession as studied. Miss Hargreaves simply nodded and returned to her toast. It was the conversation at breakfast, rather than the announcement itself, that occupied my thoughts as I made my way to find Holmes afterward. There had been about the exchanges a peculiar quality, difficult to specify but unmistakable once perceived, of statements that agreed too readily with one another. When the Colonel remarked that the previous evening had been entirely uneventful, Mr. Ellery had concurred without the brief reflexive pause that genuine recollection requires. When Miss Pencombe observed that everyone had retired early, Mrs. Darnley had confirmed it in almost the same words. It was, I reflected, the kind of testimony that is not fabricated so much as coordinated, in which the substance may be true enough, but the unanimity has been lightly rehearsed. I found Holmes in the library, standing at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, watching two sparrows contest a frozen crust on the windowsill outside, with the detached attention he sometimes directed at matters of no evident investigative relevance. "You heard the breakfast conversation," I said. "I attended it with some care, yes." He did not turn from the window. "Sit down, Watson. I want to think aloud, which is a privilege I extend to very few, and which I trust you will not abuse by agreeing with me prematurely." I sat. The sparrows resolved their dispute and departed in opposite directions. "There is an agreement in this house," Holmes began, "not a formal one, and I doubt it was arrived at by explicit discussion. It is the kind of agreement that forms among people who share a common vulnerability and discover, through the wordless calculus of self-interest, that the concealment of certain details is in their collective advantage. The question is not whether such an agreement exists. I am satisfied that it does. The question is what it's designed to conceal, and whether every party to it understands what they are concealing, or whether some of them are acting in protection of an interest they do not fully comprehend." "You think some of them may be unwitting," I said. "I think it probable. Consider Miss Hargreaves. She is a capable and conscientious woman in a position of professional dependence. She has made copies of something, by a method she hoped would not be detected, and she is protecting someone with an instinct that appears more loyal than calculating. She does not have the air of a person engaged in deliberate crime. She has the air of a person who has been asked to do something she found uncomfortable and agreed, because the asking came from someone whose claim upon her discretion she felt unable to refuse." "Sir Alister's niece," I said. Holmes turned from the window at last. "Miss Pencombe has access to every room in this house, an intimate knowledge of her uncle's habits, and a reason to avoid the study corridor that predates our arrival by, I would estimate, at least 3 days. She is also, well, and I say this not as flattery but as observation, considerably more intelligent than the household's general assessment of her suggests. She has spent a great deal of this visit performing the role of capable domestic manager, which is both what she is and a very convenient thing to be performing when one wishes one's movements through the house to appear entirely purposeful and unremarkable." I absorbed this. "And yet you do not think she is the principal mover?" "I do not. She is protecting someone also, Watson. The pattern of protection here is layered, like the rings of a tree. At the outermost layer we have the vague, cooperative silence of the company as a whole. Within that, the specific concealments of individuals, and within those, at the centre, a single purpose which all of these protective arrangements, whether their authors know it or not, are designed to serve." He came and sat down opposite me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Mrs. Darnley mentioned the day before we arrived that she had a headache and retired before dinner. Sir Alister confirmed this. Miss Pencombe confirmed this. Miss Hargreaves, when asked this morning in the course of conversation whether she had seen Mrs. Darnley the previous evening, said she had not seen her after tea. That seems consistent. It is entirely consistent, which is precisely the difficulty. Ask 3 honest people whether they saw a fourth at a particular time, and you will receive 3 slightly different accounts, because memory is individual and imprecise. Ask 3 people who have agreed upon an answer, and you will receive 3 accounts of remarkable similarity. He sat back. Mrs. Darnley was not in her room with a headache. She was somewhere in this house, doing something that required her absence to be explained away, and the explanation was provided for her by people who either knew what she was doing or knew enough to understand that her movements should not be scrutinized. The fire shifted in the grate, and the resultant small sound felt, in the quiet that followed his words, disproportionately loud. "You must speak to her," I said. "I intend to, but not yet and not directly. She's a woman of considerable internal resource, Watson. Nasisto more. And if approached before the ground is properly prepared, she will retreat behind a composure that will be very difficult to breach within the constraints of polite company." He rose again, restless in the way that indicated proximity to action rather than uncertainty. "There is one more thing I require before I am ready to speak to Mrs. Darnley, and it concerns the sealed packet itself. Specifically, it concerns the nature of its contents, which Sir Alister has thus far disclosed only in the broadest terms. This afternoon, I am going to ask him to be more precise." That conversation took place in Sir Alister's bedroom, the one room in the house that could be rendered genuinely private by the simple mechanism of a turned key. I sat in the corner as Holmes put his questions, and I watched Sir Alister's face as the older man produced, as slowly and with evident difficulty, the fuller history of the sealed evidence and the man against whom it had been gathered. The name he spoke at last, the name of the gentleman whose financial crimes had been sealed rather than prosecuted 8 years ago, produced in Holmes a single moment of absolute stillness. Then he said, very quietly, "And this man was the husband of Mrs. Sylvia Darnley." It was not a question. Sir Alister confirmed it with a single, weighted nod. I looked at Holmes. He was already looking at the locked door and at whatever lay beyond it, with the expression of a man who has found the keystone of an arch, and is now, with full deliberateness, reaching out to take it in his hands. Chapter 7. The Packet Recovered. We descended from Sir Alister's bedroom in a silence that had the particular texture of a silence shared between men who have just received information of material consequence and have not yet determined what to do with it. Holmes moved ahead of me down the corridor with his characteristic economy of motion, and I followed, turning over in my mind the full weight of what had been disclosed in that locked room. That Mrs. Darnley was the widow of the very man whose crimes the sealed packet documented was not, I now recognised, a coincidence that had brought her to Blackridge Manor at this particular moment. It was, rather, the circumstance which made her presence here the most explicable thing about the entire affair, once one possessed the key to it. We had reached the landing when Holmes stopped so abruptly that I very nearly collided with him. From below, in the direction of the study corridor, there came a sound. Not the inadvertent creak of a settling house, nor the ordinary domestic percussion of the servant's routine, but a short, sharp report, as of a small object dropped on a hard floor, followed immediately by the kind of resumed quiet that has a human agency behind it. Holmes descended the remaining stairs in 3 swift, silent steps and turned into the corridor. I came close behind him. The study door, which Sir Alister had that morning relocked and whose key he retained, stood a quarter open. The lamp on the writing desk had been lit, casting a warm and incriminating rectangle of light across the corridor floor. Holmes pushed the door fully open with the flat of his hand, and we entered together. Miss Hargreaves was kneeling beside the small bookcase to the left of the fireplace, her right hand pressed flat against the lower shelf, as though she had been in the act of rising when she heard our approach. On the floor beside her knee lay a small brass letter opener, apparently the object whose fall had preceded our arrival. Her face, which was naturally pale, had achieved in the lamplight a pallor that went beyond complexion into genuine alarm, and her eyes moved between Holmes and myself with the rapid, assessing quality of a person rapidly reordering a prepared account. But it was not Miss Hargreaves who held Holmes's attention, or not primarily. On the desk, in the full illumination of the lamp, lay a large envelope of the legal variety, bound with red tape, its seal intact. The sealed packet, absent since Monday, had returned. There was a moment of absolute stillness, in which none of the 3 of us spoke. Then Holmes walked to the desk, bent over the packet without touching it, and examined the seal with an attention so close and so prolonged that I watched Miss Hargreaves's composure deteriorate through 3 distinct stages during its duration, arriving at last at something that was, unmistakably, the threshold of confession. Holmes straightened. "Miss Hargreaves," he said, in the tone he used when the preliminary operations were complete and only the final direct business remained. "I think you had better sit down." She took the chair beside the fireplace with the mechanical compliance of someone who's made a decision and is already, in some interior part of herself, relieved by it. I positioned myself near the door, less from any intention to prevent her departure than from the instinct, accumulated over many investigations, that the geometry of a room during such a moment matters. "I moved it," she said. Her voice was steady to her credit. "I moved the packet on Monday night. I placed it in the compartment behind the lower shelf, which I discovered some months ago while reorganizing Sir Alister's reference volumes. I intended to replace it before it was missed." She paused. "I did not anticipate that Mr. Holmes would be summoned, or that the alarm would be raised so promptly." "Why did you move it?" Holmes asked. "For safekeeping." She said the phrase with a precision that told me she had selected it carefully, and that it was simultaneously true and incomplete. I had reason to believe that someone in the house intended to tamper with it, or to remove it entirely. I thought if it were concealed in a place known only to myself, it would be protected until the roads opened and proper arrangements could be made. "And the nature of this reason," Holmes said. "What specifically prompted your concern?" She hesitated with evident deliberateness. "I observed something. I would rather not say what, and I would ask that you respect my wish in that regard." Holmes regarded her for a moment with an expression that those who did not know him might have read as patience, but which I recognized as something more active, a kind of listening directed not at what she was saying but at the shape of what she was declining to say. "You observed someone in this corridor who had no business here," he said at last, "on Sunday evening, or perhaps early Monday morning, and the person you observed is someone whose confidence you feel unable to break, even now, even in these circumstances." Something in Miss Hargreaves's face shifted in the manner of a lock yielding to the correct pressure, not opening fully, but conceding the mechanism's defeat. She did not confirm it. She did not need to. "The packet appears to be intact," Holmes continued, addressing neither of us in particular. "The seal is, to visual examination, undamaged. I will not disturb it this evening." He turned to me. "Watson, would you ask Sir Alister to join us?" Sir Alister received the news of the packet's recovery with a relief so profound that it was briefly incapacitating, and then, as Holmes knew it would, the relief gave way to a secondary reaction that was rather more complicated. He stood at his desk looking down at the returned packet, with an expression that combined gratitude with the particular unease of a man who has been saved from a difficulty by means he does not fully understand and cannot entirely trust. "Miss Hargreaves acted from protective instinct," Holmes said to him. "She believed the packet was in danger and removed it to what she judged a safer location. Her intentions were sound. Her methods were imperfect. I would suggest that the appropriate response is gratitude, qualified by a request that she be rather more forthcoming in future about what she observes in this house." Miss Hargreaves accepted this characterization without protest. Sir Alister, after a moment of visible internal deliberation, accepted it also, pressing the young woman's hand with a warmth that appeared to settle the matter between them, at least on the surface. It was what occurred in the drawing-room afterward that deserves the closest attention. Holmes had asked that everyone be gathered there before dinner, offering as the pretext the practical question of communal arrangements, should the roads remain closed into Friday. The guests assembled with the collective relief of people who have been told the crisis is past and are glad to believe it. The announcement of the packet's recovery produced, as Holmes had told me it would, a range of reactions that were, in their variety and their sincerity, rather more informative than any single interview he had yet conducted. Colonel Morne expressed his satisfaction with the unaffected brevity of a man who had not been materially concerned. Mr. Ellery said the right words with the slight over-precision of someone who has been worried, and is attempting to appear merely interested. Miss Pencombe's relief was visible, genuine, and carefully modulated, the relief of someone who has reason to care more than she wishes to appear to care. And Mrs. Darnley said nothing at all for a full 3 seconds after the announcement, during which her dark eyes rested on the carpet approximately 2 feet in front of her, and then she looked up and said that she was very glad to hear it, in a voice of such perfect control that it communicated, to me at least, and I was quite sure to Holmes, something very near to the opposite of what the words themselves contained. Holmes, standing by the mantelpiece with his coffee cup, appeared to notice none of this. His gaze moved about the room with the benign, unfocused quality of a man thinking about something else entirely. He was not thinking about something else. I had known him far too long to be deceived by that particular performance, and I recognized, beneath the appearance of a satisfied investigation reaching its conclusion, the quiet, contained energy of a man who has deliberately allowed a door to close because he knows precisely where it opens. Chapter 8. The comfort of a conclusion. There is a phenomenon familiar to any physician who has practiced long enough, which is the peculiar vitality that returns to a patient the moment they are told the diagnosis is not what they feared. It is not recovery. It is the body's response to the removal of dread, a temporary efflorescence that can be mistaken for health by everyone in the room, including, sometimes, the patient themselves. The atmosphere of Blackridge Manor on Thursday evening reminded me of nothing so much as that phenomenon. The news of the packet's recovery had moved through the household like a warm current, and by dinner the conversation had acquired a lightness, a willingness to laugh at small things, that had been entirely absent for the preceding 2 days. Sir Alister was the most visibly transformed. He sat at the head of his table with the restored authority of a man who has had something taken from him and returned, and if there was beneath his ease a residual unease that a physician's eye could still detect, it was sufficiently submerged in relief to allow him the pleasure of the evening. He told a story about a celebrated case from his magistracy years, gently comic in its resolution, and the table received it with genuine appreciation. Colonel Morn contributed a tale of his own from the Punjab that was, by his own dry assessment, considerably less comic in its resolution. Mr. Ellery, who had been somewhat withdrawn throughout the day, found his sociability again over the fish course, and applied it with the professional facility of a man accustomed to making himself agreeable in rooms that contain both adversaries and allies. I watched Holmes through all of this with the combination of attention and concealment that I had refined over many years of similar evenings. He was, to the casual eye, perfectly content. He ate with appetite, listened with apparent pleasure, contributed a remark or two of mild wit, and gave no indication whatsoever of a man engaged in anything more strenuous than the enjoyment of a tolerable dinner in provincial company. The performance was flawless, which was precisely what made it so recognizable to me as a performance. He was watching Mrs. Darnley, not directly, not with any frequency that could be detected by the object of his observation, but at intervals, and always when her attention was engaged elsewhere, his eyes settled on her for 3 or 4 seconds with an expression of the most concentrated analytical interest, and then moved away with no more apparent significance than if they had been resting on the table arrangement. She was, throughout the dinner, entirely composed. She spoke when addressed. He smiled at the appropriate moments, and ate with the moderate appetite of a woman performing the social functions of a meal rather than deriving pleasure from it. There was nothing in her manner that could reasonably be called suspicious. It was after dinner, in the drawing-room, that Holmes manoeuvred with a subtlety that I admired even as I recognised its purpose. The company had settled into its habitual post-dinner configurations. The Colonel and Sir Alister at the chess table, Mr. Ellery with a periodical, the younger women at the far end of the room in conversation. Holmes, having declined the offer of chess with a regret that was entirely counterfeit, settled into the chair nearest the fire and appeared to fall into a light doze, his chin resting on his chest, his breathing slow and audible. I took my book to the chair opposite and watched him not sleep. He was monitoring behind those apparently closed eyes the movement of everyone in the room, and most particularly the movement of Mrs. Darnley, who rose at approximately 9:30, excused herself with a murmur about a letter she had promised to write, and left the drawing-room. Holmes's breathing did not alter. His chin did not lift, but I saw, in the slight and momentary tension of the hand resting on the chair's arm, that her departure had been noted and registered with the same precision as everything else. She was absent for 22 minutes. I counted, having nothing more useful to do, and because I suspected Holmes was counting also. When she returned, her expression was that of a woman who has completed a routine domestic task, settled and unremarkable. She resumed her seat, accepted a cup of tea from the tray that had been brought in during her absence, and joined the conversation at the far end of the room with a naturalness that was, taken altogether, rather too complete. Holmes woke from his apparent doze shortly afterward, accepted tea, and said nothing to me of any consequence until we had said our good nights and reached the corridor outside our rooms. "The study," he said very quietly. "Again?" She went there. Not for long, and she will not have moved anything of substance because she knows that such a movement would be detected. But she went there. He paused, his hand on his door. "I should like to examine the packet's seal again in the morning in full daylight, with the lens I did not have with me this evening." "You think she replaced it," I said, "not recovered it." "Replaced the original with a facsimile." "I think the timing of its discovery requires scrutiny. Miss Hargreaves moved the packet from the drawer to the concealed compartment on Monday night. She has now produced it and confessed to its hiding. But consider, Watson, the sequence with precision. The packet disappeared from the locked drawer between Saturday and Monday morning. Miss Hargreaves moved it on Monday night, after it had already been removed and returned, or so she believed. She may have been moving a packet that was no longer the original. I turned this over in the dimness of the corridor. The house had settled into its nighttime quiet, and the cold pressed against the walls with a patient, unrelenting insistence. Then the original was removed before Monday night, its contents examined, and a duplicate returned to the drawer for Hargreaves to find and subsequently move. It is a possibility I am not yet prepared to exclude. He opened his door an inch. "Sleep, Watson. Tomorrow I shall look at the seal, and then I shall have a conversation with Sir Alister that I have been preparing since Wednesday morning. After that I think we may arrange a small gathering." I lay awake for a time in the cold room, and the thought that occupied me most persistently was not the mechanism of the deception, intricate as it was, but the human cost of it. A woman had moved through this house for the better part of a week, performing the ordinary courtesies of a guest, managing a composure that must have required a constant and exhausting private effort, while concealing beneath all of it the weight of a dead man's crimes and her own long determination to extinguish the evidence of them. Whatever judgment the law might eventually require us to make, the sheer labour of it struck me as something that deserved to be seen clearly, even if it could not be excused. Holmes had said to me on the first evening that Sir Alister was frightened not of the loss but of what it implied. I understood now, more fully than I had then, what that implied was not merely the identity of the thief but the nature of what they were protecting. Crimes of the kind documented in that packet do not exist in isolation. They have dependents. They have people who built a life on the foundation of their profits and who, when the foundation is threatened, will act with a desperation that is not entirely without a claim on our sympathy, even when it has no claim on our mercy. The fire had gone entirely out before I slept, and the room was very cold, and outside the stars were hard and brilliant over the white grounds of Blackridge, as indifferent to the business of the house beneath them as only stars can be. Holmes had allowed the household its comfort, its false resolution, its collective exhalation. He had done so, as I knew by now, with complete deliberation. He had let the pressure off, precisely in order to see what moved when the pressure was gone. He had seen enough. Chapter 9. The Reconstruction of Truth. Friday morning arrived with a clarity that felt, after 4 days of grey oppression, almost presumptuous. The sun came fully over the eastern tree line before 9 o'clock and struck the snow with a brightness that made the eyes water. And somewhere in the depth of the estate grounds a blackbird, emboldened by the change, had begun its tentative midwinter commentary. The manservant reported at breakfast that the northern road had been cleared as far as the village junction, and that with reasonable weather it would be passable by afternoon. The news produced a visible relaxation in every face at the table, and even Mrs. Darnley allowed herself something that, under more innocent circumstances, I should have called relief. Holmes was not at breakfast. He had been in the study since first light, and when I looked in upon him at 8:30, he was seated at Sir Alister's desk with the sealed packet before him, and his lens in his hand, engaged in an examination of such minute particularity that he did not acknowledge my presence for nearly a minute. When he did look up, his eyes held the bright, settled quality that I had come to associate not with the beginning of a conclusion, but with its completion. "Sit down, Watson, and let me show you something." I took the chair beside the desk. Holmes moved the lamp and angled the packet so that the seal was fully illuminated, then held the lens over it and invited me to look. The seal was, to my untutored eye, exactly what it appeared to be, a firm, clean impression in dark blue wax, bearing the intertwined initials and crest that Sir Alister had described. The tape lay flat, the envelope's edges were undisturbed, and there was no visible sign of interference. "Now look here," Holmes said, directing the lens slightly to the lower right quadrant of the seal, "at the boundary between the wax and the tape." I looked more closely. There was, at the precise point he indicated, a very faint line running parallel to the tape's edge, no more than a hair's breadth in width, where the surface of the wax showed a slightly different texture from the surrounding area, as though the material had been applied in two distinct operations rather than one. "The seal was made in 2 stages," I said. "It was remade entirely. The original was removed with care, a thin blade introduced at the tape's edge, and worked with great patience around the full circumference of the wax disc. The original seal was then used as a mould to produce this replacement, which was applied over the resealed envelope with sufficient skill to pass any inspection that did not involve a lens and adequate light." He set down the lens. "It is excellent work, precise, unhurried, yes, and conducted by someone with both the technical knowledge and the manual steadiness to execute it under considerable pressure." He rose and moved to the fireplace, standing with his back to it in the attitude of a man preparing to deliver a considered account. "I shall tell you now what I believe happened," he said, "and you will find, I think, that the facts as I have assembled them carry their own coherence. Mrs. Darnley arrived at Blackridge with a purpose that preceded the storm and would have been achieved with or without it, the storm merely providing a convenient extension of opportunity. She had known, or discovered, that the sealed packet was held here by Sir Alister, and she had known for 8 years, that its contents documented the financial crimes of her late husband in terms precise enough to be damaging to her own position, and more critically, to the memory of a man upon whose respectable name her current social standing materially depends. She prepared the wax," I said. "She brought with her a small quantity of prepared composition wax, the kind used by jewellers and engravers, which can be softened and pressed against a seal to take an impression of exceptional fidelity. On the 1st or 2nd day of her visit, before the storm had fully closed in, she gained access to this study during one of Sir Alister's absences, and obtained an impression of the seal ring, which she accomplished not from the ring itself, which she could not reach, but from an existing wax seal on a piece of Sir Alister's personal correspondence that she found in this very drawer. The ring had been used to seal a letter here only recently. The impression it left in that letter's wax was, for her purposes, identical in utility to the ring itself. I recalled the faint circular depression on the desk's leather surface, the trace of blue pigment in the grain. She worked here at this desk. On more than one occasion, I believe. The impression-taking was one operation. The manufacture of the duplicate seal, using the impression as a mould, was another, and the opening of the packet, the removal of its contents, and the resealing were a third, conducted in the small hours of Sunday night, or the very early morning of Monday, when Sir Alister was asleep, and the key upon his bedside table was briefly accessible through the connecting door. He paused. "She is a woman of remarkable composure and considerable practical intelligence. I do not think she was assisted in the material operations. She acted alone." Then Miss Pencombe, I began. Miss Pencombe observed her in this corridor on Sunday night. She did not know precisely what she had observed, or rather she suspected it, and chose not to know with certainty, because Mrs. Darnley is an old family connection of some delicacy, and Miss Pencombe is a young woman who loves her uncle, and feared what a full understanding of the situation might require of her. She told Miss Hargreaves only that the packet might be in danger, without explaining how she knew, and asked her to ensure its safety. Miss Hargreaves moved it in good faith to the concealed compartment. By that time, of course, it had already been opened, emptied of its most damaging contents, and resealed. The document she removed, I said. Where is it? Burned, almost certainly, before the household was fully awake on Monday morning. The contents of the packet that remain are the lesser materials, the peripheral correspondence, the supporting records. The central document, the one that named her husband and quantified the particulars, is gone. Holmes's expression was measured. We cannot recover it, but we do not need to. Shortly after 11 o'clock, Holmes asked Sir Alister to assemble the guests in the drawing-room. He made the request with a quiet authority that admitted no argument, and Sir Alister, who had spent the morning with a face of increasing comprehension, complied without question. They gathered in the winter sunlight, the five of them, arranged about the room with the unconscious geometry of people who do not know what is coming and are attempting to appear as though they do not mind. Colonel Morne stood by the window. Mr. Ellery sat with the careful stillness of a professional listener. Miss Pencombe took the chair nearest the door, which was perhaps instinctive. Miss Hargreaves stood slightly apart, composed and watchful. Mrs. Darnley chose the sofa and crossed her hands in her lap and looked at Holmes with the expression of a person who is prepared for this moment, and found, now that it has arrived, that no preparation was quite sufficient. Holmes stood before the fireplace. He spoke for perhaps 20 minutes, and he did so in the manner that I had witnessed on a dozen previous occasions, but which never entirely lost its quality of inevitability, each observation following from the last with the patient, inexorable logic of water finding its level. He named no emotion and made no accusation until every fact was assembled and every avenue of alternative explanation was demonstrably closed. When the last fact had been placed in its position, the silence in the drawing-room was of a kind that I have never found easy to describe. It is not the silence of shock exactly, nor of shame, though it contains elements of both. It is the silence that falls when a truth that has been maintained in concealment for a long time is finally exposed to the air, and everyone present understands simultaneously that the effort of concealment is over. Darnley looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up and she said with a dignity that was entirely genuine, "The document is gone. You will not recover it. What remains in the packet will not be sufficient to act upon." "That is correct," Holmes said. "Then what do you intend?" Holmes was quiet for a long moment. "I intend to tell you that I know what you did, and why, and how. I intend to tell you that Sir Alister knows it also, and that it will be for him to determine what weight he wishes to place upon an act of destruction that cannot now be undone." He glanced at Sir Alister, who stood by the door with an expression of profound tiredness. "The law may have diminished claims upon you, Mrs. Darnley. I cannot speak to whether your conscience makes the same allowances." She did not reply to that. Perhaps there was no reply to be made that would not have cost her more than she was prepared to spend in that room, before those people, in that hard winter light. But something moved in her eyes at his words, briefly and without artifice, that told me Holmes had found, beneath all the composure and all the calculation, the place where she was still susceptible to truth. Chapter 10. The Lifting of the Snow. The roads were confirmed passable by early afternoon, and the business of departure, which in other circumstances might have carried the pleasant anticipation of a visit concluded, moved through Blackridge Manor with the quiet efficiency of people who have been in one another's company rather longer than was comfortable, and who require no encouragement to attend to their trunks. The manservant reported the arrival of the first carriage from the village at 1:30, and by 3 o'clock the forecourt, visible from the drawing-room windows, had accumulated the modest evidence of imminent travel. Bags arranged beside the door, a second conveyance standing behind the first, the horses patient in the cold with their breath rising in small white columns against the pale afternoon sky. Holmes and I were among the last to make ready. I had packed my bag with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who has been away from London long enough to find the thought of Baker Street genuinely appealing, and I descended to find Holmes standing in the entrance hall with his coat already on, observing the departures with the detached attention of a naturalist watching a familiar migration. The leave-takings told their own story, as leave-takings generally do when the people involved have shared a closed space for too long under conditions of strain. Colonel Morn shook hands with Sir Alistair with the uncomplicated warmth of long friendship, thanked Holmes with a brevity that was entirely sincere, and departed with the air of a man glad to be moving again. Mr. Ellery was gracious and precise, his farewells calibrated with professional exactitude to convey neither more nor less than was appropriate, and if he left with a somewhat lighter step than he had arrived, he was careful not to let it be too plainly visible. Miss Hargreaves said goodbye to Sir Alistair in a manner that expressed, in its quiet steadiness, both contrition and the kind of loyalty that survives even the awkward revelation of its limits. Sir Alistair held her hand for a moment and said something too low for me to hear, and whatever it was appeared to settle something between them, for she departed with a composure that seemed less effortful than it had been at any point during the preceding days. Miss Pencombe did not, of course, depart. She was at home. She stood with her uncle as the carriages filled and moved away down the cleared drive, and in her erect, practical bearing beside the older man's white-haired gravity there was something I found quietly affecting. A suggestion of the continuity that large old houses require of the people who inhabit them, the capacity to absorb difficult events and resume, without the indulgence of prolonged disruption, the maintenance of ordinary life. Mrs. Darnley left without fanfare and without drama, which was, I thought, entirely in keeping with what I had come to understand of her character. She exchanged the formal courtesies with Sir Alistair in the hallway, and they faced one another for a moment with the particular expression of two people who have known each other through a long arc of circumstance and have arrived at a point from which the connection cannot be resumed on its former terms. There was no hostility in it. There was something more complex and rather more final than hostility, the mutual recognition of a boundary established and unlikely to be crossed again. She paused at the door and turned briefly toward Holmes. She did not speak. He inclined his head in a single, small acknowledgment that was neither warm nor cold, but simply, in its precise degree of gravity, entirely respectful. Then she was gone. Mombe. And the sound of the carriage on the cleared drive diminished and was absorbed by the stillness of the grounds. Holmes and I took our leave of Sir Alistair in the library, where a fire had been lit against the afternoon chill, and the room had resumed the orderly, purposeful character of a working scholar's space, as if the preceding days had been a disturbance that the room itself was quietly correcting. Sir Alistair shook Holmes's hand with the grip of a man who has a great deal to say, and has concluded that most of it would be inadequately expressed by any words currently available to him. "I owe you more than I can readily account for," he said at last, "though I confess the outcome is not precisely what I had expected when I sent that telegram." "The outcome is rarely what one expects," Holmes replied, "but I think, Sir Alistair, that it is in the broad essentials what the situation permitted. The central document is beyond recovery. The remaining contents of the packet are, as Mrs. Darnley correctly assessed, insufficient for formal action. What has been recovered is the truth of what occurred and the knowledge of it, which are not nothing." "No," Sir Alistair agreed, "they are not nothing." We rode back toward the railway station through a landscape entirely transformed by 2 days of sun on fresh snow. The shadows of the trees stretched long and blue across the white fields, and the sky had acquired the particular deep, washed quality of a winter's afternoon that has been thoroughly cleaned by cold, and the light falling through the carriage window was thin and clear and without warmth. Holmes sat opposite me with his coat collar turned up and his gaze directed at the passing countryside, and for a time neither of us spoke, which was the kind of silence that accumulates naturally between two men who have been through a concentrated experience together and have reached the far side of it, and are content for the moment to let it settle. "You allowed her to keep the victory," I said at last, when we had left the manor's grounds entirely behind us. He considered this for a moment. "I allowed the situation to arrive at the conclusion it was always going to arrive at," he said. "The document is gone and cannot be restored. A prosecution without it is not possible. What I could recover was the account, the sequence of facts, the chain of reasoning. These are not without value, but she's not punished. She is known," Holmes said, "by Sir Alistair, by me, and in the way of such things, eventually by others. I'm not certain that knowledge, in cases of this kind, is an altogether lighter sentence than the law's more formal arrangements." He turned from the window. "Her husband committed the crimes, Watson, not she. She committed an act of destruction in defence of a dead man's name, which is not admirable, and which I would not excuse. But the moral arithmetic of the thing is rather less simple than it would be if she had acted for gain." I thought about this for some time, watching the white fields pass. "And the wax impression," I said. "The seal ring. She took the impression not from the ring itself, which she never accessed, but from the existing seal on a letter in the drawer. She could not reach the key while Sir Alistair was awake, and she could not guarantee enough time at the bedside table during the night. But the drawer was accessible whenever the study was unattended, and Sir Alistair had sealed a letter in that drawer only recently. The impression in that letter's wax was still sharp. She pressed her composition wax against it, and had everything she required. It was fully dark by the time we reached London, and the familiar disorder of Baker Street received us with the comfortable indifference of rooms that have waited without anxiety. Mrs. Hudson brought up a tray without being asked, and Holmes arranged himself before the fire in the attitude of a man simultaneously exhausted and stimulated, the particular posture that followed a concluded case. "There is one aspect," I said, pouring out, "upon which you have said very little. The footstep we heard on our first night in the entrance hall." "Mrs. Darnley," Holmes said without hesitation. "She had been in the study earlier that evening before our arrival, establishing the state of the drawer and confirming the packet's presence. She heard us descending and withdrew. I was satisfied of it by the following morning." I set his cup on the table beside him and regarded the fire for a moment. The case had the quality that the best of Holmes's cases always seem to acquire in retrospect, of having been, at every stage, entirely comprehensible, as if the truth had been there throughout in plain sight, requiring only the correct angle of attention to become visible. "She was there from the beginning," I said. "She was there from before the beginning," Holmes replied. "That is rather the nature of these things. The crime is always older than the investigation." He reached for his cup and the fire shifted in the grate, and outside the windows of Baker Street the city moved through its ordinary evening in its ordinary unconcerned way, entirely ignorant of the sealed room it had for a week contained, and the careful, quiet unravelling of its secrets in the snowbound silence of Blackridge Manor. I set down my pen here, having at last discharged what I have long felt to be an obligation to this particular account. The reader who has followed it to its conclusion will, I trust, understand why I delayed its publication. The living deserve the protection of time, and time, in this instance, has been given. What remains is only the truth of what occurred. A locked room, a vanished packet, a woman of formidable intelligence and divided loyalties, and the slow, patient, inexorable application of a mind that I have had the privilege of observing, at close quarters, for more years than I sometimes find it easy to believe have passed. Of Holmes himself, I will say only what I have said before, and what I expect I shall have occasion to say again. There is no one else.